Every 4 years, something happens to the planet that is difficult to describe unless you've lived through it. It isn't quite a holiday, it isn't quite a war, it is something in between, a collective fever that spreads through offices and living rooms and entire city streets, turning otherwise reasonable adults into people who weep openly in public, who cancel surgeries and job interviews and weddings because 11 strangers are kicking a ball somewhere on a pitch they will never visit. Flags appear on cars. Strangers embrace. A low hum of shared anticipation settles over everything like weather. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, there is you, completely unbothered, maybe mildly irritated that your feed has been colonized by jerseys, maybe even a little confused by your own stillness. Not defensive, not superior, just genuinely unmoved. The way you might be unmoved by a rainstorm in a country you've never been to. People have told you this is strange. Someone has probably looked at you the way doctors look at a symptom they can't immediately place. Like your indifference to a football tournament is a sign that something inside you is not working the way it was designed to. You've been called cold. You've been called disconnected. You've been called, depending on the person and the country, something far less polite. But here's where the psychology gets interesting. Because the question most people are asking, what's wrong with the person who doesn't care, is actually the wrong question. The more revealing question, the one that opens something up rather than closing it down, is this: what is happening inside the person who does? To understand why certain people feel nothing during the World Cup, you first have to understand what fandom is actually doing in the brain of someone who feels everything. When a person says we won after a match they watched from their sofa, something genuinely unusual is happening. They didn't play. They didn't train. They didn't even travel. And yet the victory feels, neurologically and emotionally, like it partially belongs to them. Researchers call this BIRG, basking in reflected glory. Robert Cialdini first documented it in 1976, watching university students wear their school's Say's apparel the morning after a win and quietly retire it after a loss. What he was really watching was the self, that strange, opportunistic, endlessly shape-shifting thing, borrowing identity from a group the way you might borrow a coat when the praver turns. You didn't buy the coat. It isn't really yours, but you are warmer for wearing it, and for a while, it feels like it fits. What sports fandom is doing, underneath all the noise and the jerseys and the face paint, is managing self-esteem. When the group wins, the self expands. When the group loses, the self quietly disowns the wreckage. Suddenly the language shifts from we to they, and the ego sidesteps the fall. This is not a character flaw in fans. It is just the mechanics of social identity, which is among the most powerful forces in human psychology. The brain of a genuinely invested fan during a tense match is a remarkable thing to observe. The uncertainty of the outcome creates a sustained state of anticipation that lights up the SCO reward circuitry, not when something good happens, but in the gap before it might. Neuroscientists call this the dopaminergic response to unpredictability. It is, structurally, the same mechanism that makes slot machines so difficult to walk away from. Intermittent reinforcement. You don't know if the next spin will pay out, and so your attention stays locked in place, waiting for a resolution that keeps not arriving. Sports exploit these reward mechanics with extraordinary efficiency. The near miss, the stoppage time goal, the penalty shootout, which is basically a psychological instrument of torture designed to keep the nervous system at maximum arousal for as long as possible. For the person who feels none of this pull, whose brain simply doesn't hook onto the outcome of a match, this is not emotional flatness. It is the absence of a prior attachment. The hook requires a stake, and a stake requires identification. Without it, the uncertainty doesn't feel compelling. It feels like watching a coin flip for 90 minutes. Not unpleasant, exactly. Just irrelevant. And here is the midpoint, the thing worth sitting with slowly. The desire the World Cup is trying to satisfy. The desire to belong to something, to feel anchored to a group, to experience the warmth of shared meaning with other people. That desire does not go missing in people who don't follow sport. It is not absent. It has simply found a different home. The tribal instinct is real. The need for collective identity is real. The longing for a room where everyone is feeling the same thing at the same time, that is one of the oldest human drives there is. But the vehicle for it is just a vehicle. And for some people, this particular vehicle, 11 strangers representing a country you were born into by accident, simply doesn't make the emotional arithmetic work. Think of it this way. For the deeply attached fan, the national team is an anchor. It is a fixed point of identity that holds them in place, gives them somewhere to return to, connects them to their father and their grandfather and the street they grew up on. The World Cup is a homecoming, cyclical and reliable as a season, that is genuinely valuable. That is not to be dismissed. But an anchor only works if it actually reaches the bottom. If the floor of your identity isn't there, if your sense of self isn't built around nationality, if your relationship to your country is complicated or ambivalent or simply quiet, then the anchor doesn't hold, it floats. And you watch the flag on the screen and feel, not hostility, just a mild curiosity about why everyone else seems to know something you don't. This becomes more layered when you track it across a life. In childhood, collective enthusiasm is almost automatic. Children absorb the room they're in. If the household cared about football, you probably cared about football, the same way you cared about the music that played in the car and the food that appeared on the table. Identity in childhood is largely inherited. In adolescence, it becomes contested. Some people double down on the inherited belonging, finding in the team a comfortable extension of who they are and where they come from. Others, and this is where non-fans often first become aware of themselves, begin to notice that the enthusiasm they've been performing is not entirely theirs. They look around at the room during a penalty shootout and realize, with some mixture of relief and confusion, that they feel mostly nothing. That the collective blanket everyone else is wrapped in doesn't quite cover them. By adulthood, this becomes settled, quieter. The non-fan stops explaining themselves as often. They make peace with the fact that certain collective experiences land for them and others don't. They may notice that the experiences that do land, a concert where everyone is singing the same words, a cultural moment that feels genuinely shared, a room where people are laughing together about the same thing, light them up in ways that are recognizable as the same hunger. Just a different meal. There is something else worth naming here, something that makes the World Cup specifically unusual even among people who follow club football regularly. Every 4 years, the event carries a social expectation that extends far beyond fans. Even people who haven't watched a match in 4 years are expected to suddenly care because now it isn't just a team, it's a nation. The emotional stakes are presumed to scale automatically because the container is larger, and for some people, the national framing does amplify everything. It taps into a layer of identity larger than the club, larger than the city, something ancient and territorial and deeply felt. But for others, and this is the part that rarely gets acknowledged, the national framing makes it stranger, not more compelling. You didn't choose where you were born. Your feelings about your country are probably not simple. They are probably not the kind of thing that resolves cleanly into a flag on a jersey. And now you are supposed to feel personally victorious because someone from that same country kicked a ball into a net. The logic is real. You can follow the path that leads there. You just can't feel it arrive. Research on social identity shows clearly that the intensity of your attachment to a group directly determines how much a group's outcomes matter to you. The correlation is almost perfectly linear. If the group never fully claimed you, the results won't either. This isn't a failure of feeling. It's how the system works. There is also a historical dimension here that tends to go unexamined because we've all grown up inside this world, and it can be difficult to see the edges of it. The particular form of sports fandom we'll back redescribing, the parasocial attachment to strangers performing athletically on a screen, feeling their wins as yours and their losses as a private grief. This is extraordinarily new in the span of human existence. For most of history, you couldn't follow a team in this way. You couldn't even conceive of one, really. The emotional relationship between audiences and strangers on screen, the one-sided intimacy that researchers Horton and Wohl were already noting in the 1950s, had no real precedent before mass media. Television made it possible at scale. Global broadcast rights made it global. The World Cup as an emotional event, the kind where 1 billion people experience the same moment simultaneously and feel it personally, is a product of the mid-20th century, not prehistory. So when sports fandom is described as a natural, universal, hardwired human experience, and some of it is, the tribalism, the collective ritual, the need to belong, the specific version we're talking about, the jerseys and the screen and the deep feeling of being personally bereaved because strangers lost a match you watched alone in your kitchen, that is a product of history. It is perhaps 60 or 70 years old at the scale we experience it now. People who are unmoved by it are not failing to access something ancient. They may simply be less susceptible to a specific, historically recent emotional architecture. And to be entirely fair, because this is not an argument against fandom, it is only an argument against shame. The research on what deep fandom provides is real and worth respecting. Highly identified supporters show measurable gains in self-esteem, lower rates of loneliness, a sense of shared meaning that quietly functions like a social lifeline for people who might otherwise feel untethered. The fan who genuinely lights up when their country scores, who carries the loss the next day like a low hum in the background of everything. They are getting something real. The belonging is real. The comfort is real. The scaffolding holds. The distinction worth drawing, and this is true in both directions, is between identity that fits and identity that has been borrowed because the room expects it. There is a version of World Cup enthusiasm that is genuine and full and warm, like a familiar room you've been coming back to your whole life. And there is a version that is exhausting performance, grief that doesn't quite feel like yours, enthusiasm assembled from available materials because opting out seemed socially costly. One of those is belonging. One of those is labor. The person who feels nothing during the World Cup is not missing the desire for belonging. They are not emotionally deficient. They are not broken in some way that the passion of fans would fix. Their attachment system is not absent. It is somewhere else. It has already found its home. In a creative community, in a friendship that requires no performance, in a body of work they care about, in a subculture that speaks their particular language, in something that makes time disappear in ways that a match never quite did. Apathy is indifference to everything. What you experience during the World Cup is something far more specific than that. It is the quiet recognition that this particular form of collective feeling doesn't reach you, and if you know what does reach you, if there is something or someone or somewhere that makes you feel that same warmth of shared belonging that the fan feels in the stadium, then you already delete is the thing the fandom was always trying to give. You don't need to explain your stillness. You don't need to fix it. You don't need to perform an enthusiasm that was never quite yours to begin with. Your brain isn't wrong. It's just already at home,